The wind came from the shivering sea and brought salt with it, and the salt stung even as snow softened the world. Jon drew it into his lungs all the same, a steadying breath that tasted of iron and far ice floes, and let it out in a thin cloud that ran away on the wind. Ghost pressed his white shoulder to Jon's thigh, silent as snowfall. The direwolf's eyes were embers under a frosted brow. The sea below hurled itself against black rock and shattered into lace, drew back, and did it again because that was what the sea knew to do. Far out, islands like the backs of whales hunched in the gray. The cliff's edge had been eaten away in a bite some winter or other, and a great rind of newly revealed stone glimmered oddly where the snow had not yet clung, glimmered like frozen smoke. Dragonglass. Jon knelt. The wind plucked at his cloak and set the ice-caked fringe to chiming. He brushed his glove across the sheer surface and felt the rippled coolness of obsidian, saw his own face swim in it. Dark eyes, a scar at one brow, a mouth in a line so practiced it had become a feature like the nose. He pressed harder and the leather rasped faint, and underneath, maybe the sound was in him, came another sound. A moving in the stone like a low voice under a crowd, the way a hall murmurs before a lord speaks. It was nonsense. Stone did not speak. Yet he remembered the caverns at Dragonstone, and the way candles had thrown light across walls scrawled with history, and Melisandre's voice at his shoulder telling him that in the heart of flame a voice speaks truth if it wills. He had no love to spare for the Red Woman or her lord, but he had learned this much. The world was wide, and he was no longer the boy who thought it solid as a castle wall. Tormund's boots broke a crust of ice behind him. "Your face looks more serious than a man about to be wed to a woman with a knife in her hand," the big man said, shaking a rime from his beard. "You like the rock, crow?" "I'm not a crow," Jon said mildly, standing. The habit of argument slipped from him like a coat shed on a warm day. The argument had been made too many times. He touched the rock once more. "But yes, I like the rock." Val came up with the wind in her hair, a seal-gray cloak flapping like a fin. Her gaze took in the exposed seam and the way the snow slid off it in an edge that draped like silk. "Obsidian," she said. Her voice had a small pride in it, as if the land had produced a child and she had midwifed. "There is more under the ice if the cliff's face runs true." "A vein. Do you mean to set men to chipping? We have hands to spare, now that the dead are truly dead." "They were truly dead before," Tormund muttered. "The trouble was the walking." Jon squatted again and put his palm flat as if to measure the cold. "We won a reprieve," he said, "not a promise." He drew his hand away and looked out where sea and sky braided together in tight gray rope. "Obsidian quenches their cold. Valyrian steel does too. Dragons do if there are dragons. We do not have dragons, but we do have this." He looked at Tormund and Val. "And we have fire." Tormund followed his gaze to the horizon. "A fine speech. I prefer a fire I can piss on if it grows too proud." "I don't mean brands," Jon said. The wind made his eyes water. He blinked salt tears away. "Fire of a different sort. Melisandre called it by a name I won't speak. The maesters call it a branch of study they do not keep on their shelves. There were forges once that were more than iron and sweat. There were words. There were ways of binding heat to matter. The old empire across the sea had many sins and one shining gift. They knew why the world burned and how to set that fire to work. We have fragments of their craft and none of their corruption. If we use the one without the other, maybe we have a chance if..." He spread his hand, palm up, as if he could balance all that came next on its breadth. "If you don't think yourself a king," Val said, and the corner of her mouth answered Tormund's grin with a ghost of one. "You and your kings. You wear the shape of them and then say you are otherwise." "I don't want a crown," Jon said. The wind took that for a vow and whipped it away to test along the gull-snarled cliff. "No," Tormund said, "but men want you to want one. They like a simple tale, and a crown makes a fine simple. We free folk don't drink such stories without biting the cup first." He scraped his palm over the black stone and then sniffed his glove as if smell would teach him something. "Who will make this firework for you?" "Red Woman gone. The last one we fed to the snow. She's not the only one who looks into flames, John replied. There are others, and there are maesters who have read books they pretend not to own. There are ironmongers who have built a thing because they had a dream and then found it worked. Some craft goes on without kings and priests. We'll find it. His hand came down flat on the obsidian again. The breath left him as if the rock had pushed it out with a cool palm. If stone had a memory, this stone remembered heat. There was a whisper caught in its layers like a fly in amber. He did not hear words. He heard intention. He had felt something like it once, leaning against a living trunk and feeling that the tree had known his hand as a sparrow might know a branch. The Dragonglass knew flame. It loved flame the way a hound loves the hand that first fed it. He had an absurd thought. Teach the glass a new hand to love, a hand they could give it that was not a dragon's mouth. He grimaced at himself and looked at the others. It's a vein? He asked Val, because this was the portion of thought he could show. It runs north and down, she said. We saw it when the shelf collapsed last thaw. I think it reaches a cave where the coast bites in. There's steam there when winter's fist is tight as a miser's. A hot spring under the sea's skin. John turned to Tormund. Steam and stone. We buoy. LD where heat rises. We take the stone and we take the heat. We make a place that does not kneel to winter the way the rest of the world must. Not to rule it, to live in it and keep watch. You describe a city, Tormund said. There was no scorn. There was careful, which in Tormund was rare and so notable. John thought of Valyria. The name was a rumor and an ache. All bright bridges and screaming pits. Slaves. Dragons. A doom nobody had earned and everybody paid. He did not want that. He wanted something else that might share only the shape of boldness. A holding, he said. A folly, perhaps. A place where we gather knowledge and put it to work. A new. He stopped at the thought of the word and its weight, tasted its metal. If he named it, it would be made of the name. Not Valyria, he said at last. If I borrow their fire, I mustn't borrow their sins. A new something else. In the north. The north is old and doesn't love new somethings, Val said, but not as refusal. She stood into the wind, eyes narrowed. We free folk do not love cities either. We like to come and go. Then it must be a place for coming and going, John said. A hearth you can leave. You return when the weather turns or when there's work to be done. When you're hungry for flame. No walls high as mountains to keep prisoners in and enemies out. No califs. If I can manage that. Men will try to manage it for you, Tormund said cheerfully. And you'll throw them in the sea when they do. Good. I like a plan that includes throwing. John smiled despite the cold. Felt like a mistake and a bomb at once. Let's go down, he said. I want to see the cave. The path was hacked into the cliff by men with a grim taste for danger and salt. Rime had softened its edges, and their boots slid until they found their own rhythm. Ghost went ahead and placed his great feet with a dancer's sureness. At a point where the path narrowed to a blade, John put his hand against another exposed slice of glossy black and, without meaning to, murmured, "You burned once." If the rock answered, it did so in the way of raindrops answering thirst. When they came to the cave, it was as Val had said, breath from a giant's mouth. Steam rose in threads from the dark water and braided itself into the air, and a rim of ice had formed at the margins where the warmth met the night and negotiated, a filigree fragile as spun glass. Men had paused here on other nights. There were old ashes and the pale teeth of fishbones cast aside. The roof of the cave arched like a tongue. Here, too, the glass shone, and in a great sheet that sloped down into submerged darkness. John crouched and put his hands to the warm, wet rocks. "We can make a forge here," he said quietly. "We can channel the heat. Stone tunnels to guide steam to where it's needed. Vent chimneys in the cliff face." He saw it as lines of chalk on a slate only he could see, saw men as dots moving between them, women carrying baskets of powdered glass and iron filings, boys with tools too big for their hands who would nonetheless learn because they had to live, to make something of the long daylight of summer that would last through nights of knives. "We make a place where the fire does not go out save by our will." Tormund sat on a rock and hugged his knees with an air of trial. You always were a builder at heart, Jon Snow. Even when your house was falling on your head, you were counting the stones to see how to put it back. I've been good at breaking too, Jon said, and the steam ghosted that truth kindly. Truth, Tormund agreed, but you prefer mending. I can live with that. And what will you call this place? Val said. Men will ask, and your answer will grow teeth. Jon looked into the water. His face broke in it and reformed. A hearth, he said again. The word felt harmless in his mouth and fierce in the chest. A hearth has edges, but it is for sharing. It's an invitation. It's also a warning. This burns. He stood and wiped wetness from his hands. Let's go back. We'll need masons. We'll need ironworkers who can be taught to unlearn old things. We'll need somebody who knows too much about forbidden books. You mean Sam, Tormund said, because despite his bluster, he often saw the shape of Jon's thoughts. Sam knows more than he wanted, Jon replied. A warmth that wasn't the caves touching him. I'll send for him, and for others. There are red priests who want the world to be a furnace. There are maesters who want the world to be stone. We need both and neither. I'll try to put them in one room and make them teach each other how to be human. Ghost sneezed, which might have been agreement. They climbed back into the wind and walked the edge of the world to the place where their ponies stood huddled like fallen stones under furred blankets. Snow began while they rode, not a blizzard, but a patient fall that wanted to erase in an orderly fashion. The sea turned a heavier gray and then a slate that looked permanent until the next minute reshaped it. Jon's thoughts set a steady tread alongside the hooves. The cave's idea moved through him. It was audacious, perhaps foolish, perhaps the only sane thing left. He held it lightly, the way he had learned to hold a kitten as a boy, support, but let it choose the way its head turned. They reached the trees, and the trees spoke in thawed voices. The bit of the world shielded by their needles always felt like a room to Jon, not courtly but intimate. The hum of sap in deep would replace the ocean's roar, and a squirrel's scrabble startled him as a laugh in a chapel might. When they made camp among snug trunks where the snow fell softly, he drew his cloak around him and leaned his back against a pine that had lived through storms with a stubbornness he admired. The fire they kindled was small, reluctant, a little son half-born. Val roasted fish over it on spits, their skins blistering and sighing oil. Tormund told a short story that had no point and so had a better point than any sermon. Ghost settled with his chin on Jon's boot and watched the flames the way a learned man watches words. When Jon slept, the fire followed him. He stood on a plain of glass that stretched to the horizon, and above him were bridges that sang when the wind passed, thin and strong and curved as the backs of swans. People moved along them, not chained, not driven. They looked up with faces like faces seen in windows, quickly and with curiosity. He could not move his feet. They had rooted, and where they touched the glass little blossoms grew, black as midnight and bright around the edges. Somewhere a great breathing shifted, and he knew it was not a beast and not the world and yet both. On the breath rode a word he was not ready to hear. He woke with the taste of ash in his mouth and a certainty that felt like the first step onto a road. 2 ravens found them in the morning. Ravens find anyone they mean to. One wore a bit of blue thread on its leg where a white feather grew. Jon knew the hand that had tied it. The other had a mottled breast, as if someone had spilled ink there and tried to wipe it away. He fed them bits of fish skin and warmed his fingers through their presence. He wrote brief, precise lines on a scrap of waxed vellum with a thorn and burnt stick. Sam, I need you if you're willing. Bring what you dare. Bring that which sets glass to remembering heat. He hesitated over the last line. He added, if you cannot come, send a book that will walk in your stead. He tied the strip to the thread on the familiar bird and whispered a thing he could not have said aloud. Come because I want you here, whatever the use. The second raven he sent to White Harbor and the Mandalese with a simpler message. I require men who can shape stone without thinking with their hands alone. I require a portion of courage and the pay that courage deserves. I require secrecy for a little while. I'll pay in winter wheat and promises kept. If you can send me a ship, send that too. When the birds went up, the morning broke thin and winter blew, and the steam that rose from the mouths of men and beasts looked like penance. They rode south that day and the next, passing through an old forest where the trees leaned over the path to examine travelers, and a creek that had made up a song and would not shut up about it. People marked their coming in the way of the north. Few words, a nod to a man they had decided to trust for reasons they would not name. Children stared at Ghost, and Ghost pretended not to notice because praise embarrassed him. They slept one night in a longhouse among free folk who had learned to lay their fires differently when they slept under roofs, and who still queued for meat the way they had in camps, with jokes to make the waiting lighter. John walked among them like a shadow a lamp had chosen to carry, and he listened. "If we build," he told a woman patching a reindeer-hide boot as if the boot were a quarrelsome child, "you will be the ones to decide where the doors go." She didn't look up. Doors are not the question. The question is windows. You put a door where men go. You put windows where the light comes, so nobody forgets to look out. "Then you will tell us where the windows go," he said, and her mouth twitched in the way a strong mouth twitches when pleased against its will. When Winterfell rose from the land, fuming gently in the cold from its private springs, John felt the ache in him change its key. He slowed before the gate long enough to see the outline of the familiar. Towers like fingers broken and reset, walls that had learned humility and pride by turn, banners that had been newly dyed and so still smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. The men at the gate nodded, and then their nods became something else when they saw him true. One of them grinned, and then thought better, and pretended instead to adjust his grip on his spear. He was not done here, not interrupted. He was returned like a tide. Sansa received him in a room with steam in the corners like lace, her hair in a coil that would have served to rope a cow, her hands bare because the heat allowed it. She was a winter queen without crown or throne, the sentence written in neat lines upon her mouth and eyes that had seen courts and kitchens and made peace between them. "You smell of the sea," she said when the room was cleared of 3 careful attendants and 1 glance-heavy guard. "I brought it with me," John said. He hesitated. No more hesitations. He told her what he had in mind. He told her about the vein of obsidian and the cave with breath, and the way he felt the rock thrumming like a memory, and he told her he wanted to build a place that was a hearth and not a pyre. Sansa watched him as if a loom had decided to speak. There was calculation there because she had learned to count wolves even in dreams, and there was affection because some ties were knotted too deep for knives. "You cannot build this without frightening every lordling from Widow's Watch to the Rills," she said. "You might as well say aloud that you mean to make magic a trade. The word will run faster than your ravens." "I know," John said, "but I won't do it in secret, only in quiet. There's a difference, and I'll ask instead of command. Those who come will come because they believe in it or because they're curious. I'll send coin and we'll pay fair. I don't want to take. I want to make." She tapped her finger once on the table where the wood had cracked and been mended by someone who cared about the sort of seam that tells a story. "You ask me for men, and for a promise in my voice, and for my name beside yours in a letter, so that others do not sneer when yours arrives lonely." "I ask it," John said, "and let the humility be as plain as hunger." "Very well," she said. "If we put fire to work in the north, I would rather it be in hands that know the cost of frost. But it must be ours, not some priest's, not some maester's experiment. Ours. Ours," John said. "I will not bend knee to a god or a guild. I'll bend it where I used to, in the snow when a child fell down." She leaned back, and tiredness loosened her a little and let something else through. A younger sister who had learned the dance and found in it an odd grace. "You won't be able to keep this small." "I don't mean to keep it at all," he said. "I mean to set it going and walk alongside it to make sure it doesn't devour anything it shouldn't. That's the best I can promise. There's no safety in any of it." Sansa laughed with no sound and showed her teeth. "There's no safety anywhere, brother. If there were, we'd have found it by now." Her gaze softened at the edges. "Sam will come," she said. "I can see it on your face that you wrote to him. He will come waving a book, and you will tell him to put the book down long enough to eat. You will be kinder than you think you should be, and it will save someone. Do that." "I will," John said, and wondered as he always did where in him the warmth came from when it came, as if an underground spring had decided not to die. They ate together that night with a clutch of old friends and newer allies who had learned to like one another despite habits that would have made their ancestors spit. Davos Seaworth had sailed the world enough to know that ships move with stories as much as wind. He had arrived in White Harbor and come inland with frost on his eyebrows and a grin. He shook John's hand and then shook it again. "You'll be needing ships," he said without preamble over a trencher of something thick with barley. "I'll find them. I'll bring you obsidian from the bloody tooth of Dragonstone if I have to pry it myself. If I can convince the men that what comes out of it will pay for the broken backs. And tell me straight, will it?" "I can't promise any man riches," John said, "but I can promise that if anything you carry helps keep children alive through a winter none of us deserve, you'll go to your grave with that weight taken from your shoulders." "That's not coin," Davos observed, "but it spends fine with a man like me." He swallowed and wiped his beard. "I have a notion that the new in your mouth is better than the old still bleeding in mine. We'll bring what we can. I'll speak to White Harbor. Wyman's granddaughter has a temper like a boiling kettle and a brain like a wharf. Between the two of them, she'll build you a pier on that cliff if you ask." From the other side of the board, Val said, "We've no use for a pier. We'll use boats that can kiss a rock and not weep. We'll show them how." "You can show them whatever you like," Davos said amiably. "I'll show them how to keep the books so no one steals the fish out of their own bellies." Tormund leaned across and clapped him on the shoulder with a hand that could have stopped a cart. "You talk but you don't lie. I'll allow you at my fire." "I'll consider that my knighthood," Davos said with a little bow that mocked nobody. Ghost wandered between legs and accepted admiration with a disdain that made people braver. John ate until his stomach recognized it was a place and slept in a room where the springs sang and a window showed him the night as a black bowl holding one cold star. He dreamed not at all, which was its own gift. Sam came on the 7th day, breathless in a way that had nothing to do with stairs. He had lost some of the softness he had always carried like a plea for forgiveness, and his eyes had gained angles. He hugged John and then held him away and looked in his face the way men look down wells to see if they can see their own eyes reflected and so know how deep it goes. "You wrote the word remembering," he said, "about the glass. John, I have read scrolls that the Citadel carries in boxes with no names, the way you carry bones you're ashamed to admit came from your own family. There are candles made of obsidian that burn without flame. They don't burn down, they burn through. And if they burn, those nearby will dream in a way that is not sleep. They made them by..." He glanced around and lowered his voice not from superstition but from consideration. "By marrying heat to stone with words and a breath given in joy or fear. Joy is better, the old texts insist, or so they say. You wrote the word remembering. That is very close to the word the scrolls use." "I didn't choose it, I think," John said. "It chose me. The stone feels like memory." Sam pushed his fingers through his hair until it stood like a frightened bird. "I brought it." At John's look, "No, not the candle. The book that walks. You asked for that. Here." He held out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied as if a child had tied it with his good hand and bad hand together. John undid the cord and peeled back the cloth. Inside lay small, square tablets of black glass edged in bronze, bound together on one side with a hinge of bright metal. Runes limned faintly on their faces, which were as mirror-smooth as any vanity. "You read by touching," Sam said, "if the candle is lit. If not," he grimaced, "then you read with your careful. The writing shows under a light but not all at once, so it is slow and it is not what you want in a siege. But it is what we have." John ran a thumb over the cover and felt it hum to him, as if a wasp slept inside. "How did you take it from the Citadel?" he asked. "I didn't," Sam said with aggravating honesty. "You gave me permission when you told me to ask instead of steal. I asked the man who keeps keys to rooms nobody opens. I told him that if he wanted the North to be a place he or his grandchildren could visit without a prayer on their tongues, he might consider letting knowledge breathe in the cold. He is a coward and he is a collector. Between the two, I got what I came for. You've grown bold, John said, and something nodded between his ribs.
Ive grontard, Sam corrected.
And sometimes that looks the S. Aim. He peered at John's face again. You look older, he said. It's not the beard. I feel older, John replied. He set the book down with reverence that had nothing to do with books. Come see what we're building, Sam. Bring your care. Bring your doubts. Someone should always be telling me I'm an idiot when I need to hear it. I've never enjoyed that task, Sam said, but he smiled. I'll try harder. They went north with a train that looked like an argument brought to life. Sledges and carts, ponies, big, black-eyed reindeer with breath like kettles. A long, low boat on a wooden cradle that men swore under as they hauled because the sea was not always where a seaboat wanted to be. The boat bore a name in the old tongue written in new paint by a girl of 14, and the name meant carries the fire. There were ironworkers from White Harbor who rubbed their hands together as if friction could teach them patience. And there were free folk who had once set traps for men and now set traps for laughter. There were 2 maesters with their chains hidden and 1 woman from Volantis who wore a thin red cord about her throat and no other sign of her god but the way she watched the flame when anyone lit a cook fire. She came to John at dusk while the train rested beside a line of stones set up by somebody's ancestor with a fine eye for straight. They call me Verena, she said. Her common tongue had soft edges where the sea had filed them. I knew a man once who saw something in the fire and mistook it for a crown. He died. You are not wearing a crown. This gives me hope and worry. She smiled without mirth. When the fire speaks, it burns. When it burns, it speaks. If you mean to ask it questions, be ready with answers of your own. I won't ask it to make choices for me, John said, and I won't burn anyone to please it. If that offends you, you should go back. If it offended me, I would not have come, Verena replied. She touched the red cord as if making sure nobody had cut it while she watched the talking. You hope to feed the glass with flame without a dragon to chew it for you. This is difficult but not impossible. Iron and salt know how to trick a dragon. A volcano is a dragon asleep. There are ways to borrow breath. Teach me, John said simply. Verena's mouth tilted. You hate the god I serve. I don't hate your god, John said. I hate what men do with gods, and I hate being told that a voice in a flame is kinder than a voice at a bedside. But if you know a way to give a child a winter that isn't knives, then I'll listen. I know a way to make a candle that is a window, she said after a pause. As for winters, we all are learning that together. She looked toward the cliff line as if a man she had loved long ago stood there. Do you carry a sword? Yes. Will you use it to cut a throat if your fire tells you to? No. Good, Verena said briskly. Then we can begin without stumbling over that. I'll ask for helpers who can count to 30 without looking at their fingers. I'll ask for roofs that don't make smoke lie down. And I'll ask for somebody who can stop a fight with the word enough. You, or someone of yours. Torment, John said. When he says enough, it's as if a door closed and men remember they are cold. That will do, Verena said and looked satisfied. We'll build a bright forge that breathes along the same rhythm as the cave. The glass will learn the breath. Men can learn from glass. Sometimes. They reached the cliff on the 10th day. The sea lifted its usual rage to them, and they answered with lines and sweat. The boat kissed rock as the girl's paint commanded and did not weep. Men and women moved along the narrow path like ants that had decided to build a tower to shame the sky. They drove markers in the snow and then into the rock, and the first day's work was mostly naming. Verena walked with a measuring rod made of beech and marks burned along it, and Sam walked with a book and drew with a sharpened bone dipped in soot. Davos walked with a coil of rope and told men who thought they could do a thing faster that they were welcome to try as long as they told him first how they meant to live afterward with a broken neck. They built a small forge under a rock lip and fed it with pipe-leading steam so that its belly woke and its sides warmed and did not crack. They set round stones in a ring, and in the ring a crucible shaped by a woman who had made pots for quiet food her whole life and now wanted to make a pot for something that might change the world. Verena sprinkled. No, that was not the right word. She placed thin lines of salt and iron filings around the ring. Lines are not for gods, she told John, who watched with a craftsman's attention. Lines are for minds. When a thing is bound, it is bound by the understanding that this mark means stop. Stone understands that the way a horse understands a wall. I don't intend to trap anything that isn't dangerous, John said. Everything is dangerous, Valyria said, but some dangers we invite to table. Salt for memory, iron for... She hesitated. For disappointment, maybe. I don't know the right word in your speech. A quality in the world that says no and survives saying it. It's a good thing to have at a fire. Sam hissed softly when his thumb touched the crucible's rim by accident. This burn, he said to nobody in particular, will remind me not to brag when nothing has even worked yet. Brag when it does, Tormund suggested, passing with a beam on his shoulder. People like a story with a loud piece. They fed small chips of obsidian to the crucible and then larger ones. The heat did not melt the glass the way a hearth melts fat. It softened it the way a stern face softens when someone else is kind without asking permission first. Valyria stood by the ring and breathed with the bellows as if she could sink her lungs with the forge's body. John fed it with wood and peat and dreams. He said Nothi, ing that a priest would call a prayer. His words were simple and meant. Let this work. Let the good survive the dangerous. The first day they watched the glass become a molten thing and then become itself again. A little changed perhaps, a little more apt to recall heat. The second day they tried iron and glass together. Iron heated until it glowed and then dusted with crushed obsidian in thin layers as if dressing a wound with ash. The iron took the glass into its skin in a pattern that Sam called a script and Valyria called scales. When they quenched that iron in salt water, the steam went up with a hiss that made men step back and then laugh because fear dissolved more easily when shared. The rod they drew out was darker than iron, not the sleek darkness of true Valyrian steel, but a gray with secrets in it. Held to the light, it showed faint ripples like the memory stone's surface. John weighed it in his hand and felt it balance as if it wanted to teach him a dance. He cut with it into a block of frozen spruce, and the wood yielded without complaint. It will take an edge, the ironmonger said. His words grudged because he did not like to give optimism away. Whether it will keep it is another question. The other question is what it does to the dead, Tormund said. All this is very pretty, but I want to see a head absolute. We do not have a dead man to hand, Sam said sharply. Valyria's glance scolded without malice. Let us make a line of protection first. We listen to the metal afterward. She drew them with her to the cliff's lip where the path narrowed. If the old tales are true, she said, and some are, then glass learns to stand with heat at its back. Once it knows that it dislikes anything that is the opposite of heat. Coldness without forgiveness. We'll ask it to stand for us. She took a shard in each hand, thin and sharp as a thought, and held them together until their edges kissed. John saw a faint glow along the seam, not a light, exactly, but the memory of one. Valyria breathed out and the seam stayed dreaming. Sam went to his book and found a page by touching the hinged glass with careful fingers. There's a sign, he said, like a branch with 3 forks. It might be the word for guard, or for wake, or for open, which would be inconvenient. Valyrian script is... He grimaced. It's as contrary as a mule. Valyria, wake, she said. We ask the glass to wake when anything that isn't alive comes near it walking as if it were. We say, you knew fire once. Wake where there is no fire. Be that. They set the shard seam across the path, embedded in stone with mortar that smelled of vinegar and volcanic springs. John knelt and put his palm to it and felt a prick along the scar on his brow as if the mark were listening. Let it be enough, he said, not to anyone present. That night the wind laced and unlaced itself in the cliff's teeth. Men and women rolled in their blankets and dreamed of doors they could not open or open too easily. John sat awake with only ghost and the sea for company and felt the world change in small ways the way a body changes when it heals. Invisible, insistent. He thought of a city he would not call a city, a place that would teach fire to serve and not to rule. It would have rooms where a builder from the city of canals could argue with a spearwife from beyond the frost over whether a wall should sing when the wind played it. It would have a hall where children learned to count by casting stones into a bowl, and then learned to count something else entirely when a candle woke. He thought of doors and windows and where light comes. Near dawn, a figure stumbled along the path with a motion that was not human. Came without stealth. It came like hunger. The night had been quiet. The watch had done what watchmen sometimes do when quiet and weariness lay heavy. The figure's tread made a rasp. The rasp made the hair on John's neck rise. Ghost lifted his head and made no sound at all, which was a sound of another sort. John rose, sword in hand, because habit. He moved to the path because he had always moved where the danger was most likely. The thing came into view by increments. First the pale rag of a sleeve, then fingers like frozen roots, then a jaw that had once held a beard and now held nothing but air and sorry. It met the line of weight glass. Light is not the right word for what happened. Perhaps the shard remembered light and tried to be it again. The seam went from dream to attention. A brightness like heatless sun rushed along its length and through the stone. The thing that had walked into it jerked as if a hand had reached through its chest and turned a key. It opened its mouth as if to speak and fell. The motion was as modest as a man's name being written and then crossed out. When it lay still, what lay still was not an unholy thing anymore. It was a dead thing, ordinary in its sorrow. The watchman came panting and ashamed. John said nothing at first because he was watching the seam, which had dimmed again to a memory. He put his palm on it and, yes, he thought, yes, this will do. Not to win, to make a chance. Tormund arrived and towed the corpse with the gentleness men reserve for enemies they fought before breakfast. There, he said, you've made a bite in the winter. It will bite back. We'll give it teeth to chew on, John said. He knelt, and for the first time in a long while he said words that might have been prayer if the night did not mind being cheated. Forgive us, he said to the dead thing, who had no ears to hear and no right to forgive. We'll try to be worth the fire. That day work changed. Men moved with the alacrity of those who have seen a thing do what it promised. Word ran along the white world with the speed of rumor and the steadiness of need. The glass wakes. The glass stands. The glass will stand for you if you ask it properly. White Harbor sent back a reply raven with its breast stained fish pink. They had foe. ND a ship nimble enough to dance along teeth. Dragonstone sent a blunt message. We'll sell you obsidian, but the price is your oath not to set up a rival mint for legends. Davos laughed and wrote back something that made them send twice what they had meant to and a caution that read like a toast. They built. There is a sort of happiness only work gives, a rightness that shrinks grief to a shape a hand can hold. John slept well because exhaustion is a kind of prayer answered and woke with the sea in his nose and went back to the forge. Beware joy, Valyria told him. Not because it is wrong, but because it is a fire that eats wood quickly. Find another log before this one is ash. He took her meaning and sent 2 messengers south to the lonely towers where maesters grew like mushrooms. One carried a letter written by Sansa in a cool hand that asked for the loan of men who were not entirely convinced by their own chains. The other carried a bag of coin that said another thing altogether. Men came. They looked uneasy. And then they touched the glass and their unease turned into curiosity like snow into steam. A week after the first seam woke, they pulled a blade from the bright forge that made even the ironmonger stop with his mouth slightly open as a boy at a puppet show. It was not Valyrian steel. It did not pretend to be a thing it was not, but it carried through the air with a promise of slicing that invited neither struggle nor triumph. It meant to pass and pass cleanly. Valyria held it and then passed it to John like a woman passing a newborn and the fear with which love carries. He took it, and the metal spoke to his arm with a weight that said, I am your secret held lightly. He made a cut through a stick that Tormund had been whittling, and the stick parted as if eager to divide and become 2. It needs a name, the ironmonger said gruffly, because naming is not a man's art, and yet he longed to claim it. Later, John said. He had learned this much. Names change what they bind. They tested the blade at dusk when the cliff's shadow made a second world on the sea. John took it to the seam of weight glass and laid the edge along the black as if to greet a peer. The faint, almost light that lived in the seam shivered and then steadied. The blade drank what it was given. John felt a warmth run along the metal and into his hand. Ghost stepped closer and ensouled the scene with his breath. Tormund said under his breath, "Give it a stupid name, I beg you, so men will not nerve their spines saying it." "Quiet Dawn," John said without intending to, "because sometimes the right words are waiting and pounce when your mouth opens." "Ridiculous," Tormund said happily. "It'll do." They made 10 more blades as the days went and gave none away. They were not hoarding. They were learning caution. They set more seams along the path, and then along a second path they had opened with chisels and curses. They learned how to set a line around a camp and sleep without a man's elbow always ready to nudge him awake. The lines did not stop hunger or heartbreak or foolishness. Nothing does. But they stopped a thing that had made men too tired for anything else. This was a kind of grace. Sansa came to see with her own eyes, bringing a retinue that looked like a migrating flock of pragmatists. She stood in the steam and watched the forge breathe and watched Valyria breathe with it. She said nothing until she could say the thing that mattered. "This will frighten them, John. Not because it is wicked, but because you made it without bowing to someone they know. A lord, a book, a god. They will ask who owns it." "Nobody," John said. "Everyone," she said at the same time. And they both smiled because the same answer wears more than one face. "Then we write it down so they cannot pretend later that they did not hear. A charter. You hate words that aren't said in a room, but sometimes the things on paper teach men how to behave when the room grows loud." "Write it," John said. "Say that no man will be a slave. Say that knowledge here will be given to anyone who can carry it without breaking it. Say that the North will own the work but not the workers. Say that if anyone tries to take this by force, the glass will wake against them as if they were the dead." "You write well when you try," Sansa said. "You should try, but I'll put my hand to it. A good charter is a list of doors." Sam added a clause about stewardship of heat so that men did not strip the forest to feed the forge. Valyria added no words. She burned a hair-thin line of salt into the first page so that men who read it felt thirsty and remembered truth. Tormund signed with a thumbprint that looked like a continent. Davos signed with a flourish that made him blush and then call himself an idiot. John pressed his name in the old style that had no furs on it and felt the weight of a thing not acquired but accepted. News reached them like birds blown off course. A ship from the Summer Isles had put in at White Harbor with glass of another kind and men who sang while they hammered copper into shapes that made the wind sing along the cliff. A band of Ironborn had offered to protect the shipments for a fee and then, discovering that everyone had a long memory of their protection, offered instead to carry rope and pitch with their hats in their hands. A man in Old Town had fallen asleep by a candle and woken seeing dreams that were not his and now wanted to sell his candle to anyone who would take his burdens in exchange. The world was listening. It had not decided yet whether to applaud or jeer. That was fine. John had learned he did not need the world to make up its mind to take the next step. On a night when the sky was a clean bowl and the stars looked like nails hammered in by a god with a steady temper, John stood again at the cliff's lip with Ghost and looked north where the world was the color of no word. He thought of the old empire and its bridges singing and its people, chained, and of the doom that had been their answer to the question, how far? He thought of Quiet Dawn lying nearby in its wrappings, not sleeping, not awake. He thought of a boy who had known only walls and a man who had learned where to put windows. The wind laid its long hand on him and for once did not shake him, only steadied him as if to say, look. He looked. The sea glittered in a way that had nothing to do with moonlight. Far out, a seam rose where water lay heavy, and steam blew in a line as neat as a thought underlining itself. Valyria came to stand beside him, her hair a dark rope. She held something cupped in both hands, and the something shed no light and yet announced itself. She opened her hands. A candle of black glass lay there, its surface living. It did not burn. It had the memory of burning, which is a more dangerous thing. "The breath is borrowed," she said, "from the cave, from the place under the sea where the world's belly laughs without humor. Light it." "No," John said, and saw her surprise with gratitude because he had not known he would say it either. "Not yet. Let it sit. Let it learn our names. The first thing we light should not be a thing that listens too hard. We'll set seams. We'll make tools. We'll build a hall where men can argue with good sense. Then the candle. You are wise in this?" Verena said softly, as if it were an apology. "I'm terrified in this," John said, not proud. "Sometimes the two are cousins." They housed the candle in a chamber cut into the rock where the steam wrote sermons in the air and set a guard, not to keep men out, but to keep fear from walking in with men when they entered. Sam went down by turns and came up with a look of bewildered peace, as if a book had forgiven him for ending a page with a smear. Tormund went down once, snorted, and said the candle made him think of old lovers, which was either praise or warning. Val did not go down. She said she had no business with the candle until it asked for her. Verena slept beside the door like a dog would and woke whenever someone passed by. Her eyes opened before her mouth knew her name. The hall grew by hands. They laid it in a shelf where cliff met slope, the walls of smooth black stone interleaved with rough gray blocks that anchored the sleekness. The roof was timber cut from the old forest with thanks, and each beam carved with a line that meant in the old tongue, "Remember the outside." Windows faced the sea like eyes, and shutters carved with patterns of scales through thin shadows when closed, so the room was never dark save by intention. A long table ran down the center, and the benches were made so a man could stand quickly without stumbling over status. At one end of the hall, a hearth stood wide, and across it a shallow bridge of obsidian ran, a span that sang when hot and slept when cold. "No idols, no throne." A chair near the hearth where a man could be found if you needed an answer or a kindness. People came. They came with goods to trade and with problems that required someone patient and with old songs and new jokes. A girl of 9 showed Tormund how to set a seam of glass along a doorway so that men of ill will felt a prickle on the back of their necks and went away thinking of neglected errands elsewhere. A woman from the far north taught Sam the names that the free folk had for the stars, and he wrote them down with a concentration that honored the long dead who had named them first. Men quarreled over who had the right to the fish in a cove that had the look of belonging to both. John listened and said, "Do you want to eat this year or win an argument that you will only win once?" They glared and then saw it and set up a counting stick to share the catch with the moon as witness. Sansa sent men to measure and to argue and to build a road that was not a road but a promise. Packed earth, stones in the right places, runes at the crossings that told those who could read them to be decent. She came herself and sat in the hall and signed the charter in front of men who had thought to question her right to sign anything. "We write it on paper," she said, "and we write it in the way we behave. The second matters more, but the first keeps the second from forgetting." She told John he was a fool and she loved him and he should eat more onions because he looked thin. One evening when the sea had tired itself and lay down to breathe slowly, a man in gray with a chain under his collar came and would not sit. He looked around as if expecting someone to accuse him. "I am Maester Keth," he said to nobody, and then to John because John had the face of this place. He touched the ring of Valyrian steel that was hidden among his more ordinary links. "I want to see the candle lit. I've wanted to since I was a boy, and my mother told me fairy stories about lamps that teach. If you light it without me, I will fall down dead of envy, and you will never be rid of my ghost." "You can wait," John said, "and not die of envy. We are not lighting it yet." Maester Keth stared at him and then, to John's relief, laughed as a kettle laughs when it decides to boil. "Good," he said. "Very good. I have watched too many men light things because the room was dark and then spend the night arguing with the light over what it meant. I will wait. In the meantime, I will teach your smith how to let the iron be itself when it wants to be glass and not scold it for confusion." "Teach him and let him teach you in return," John said, and Keth nodded in a way that suggested he had been waiting for someone to say what should have been obvious. The days lengthened. They measured time in seams set and meals shared and the number of times Ghost left the cliff path to chase an idea only a wolf would entertain. John worked until his hands remembered their boyhood and then moved past it into something else. Not quite lord, not quite smith, not quite priest. Some third making. He learned Verina's breathing to the extent N can learn another's breath. He learned to stop a fight with enough the way Tormund did. He learned to tell a child that the fear she felt by the candle's door was not wrong and not to be ignored, and then sat with her twice as long as he had meant to while she told him how the dead had once stood outside her tent and asked politely to come in. At last, on a night with no wind, a rare, unnerving thing on that cliff, they decided. Not decided because they hungered, decided because they had put enough logs aside. The hall was full but quiet. Sansa sat near the windows and watched their reflections move among the stars. Davos leaned against a pillar and curled his rope end in and out of itself. Tormund sat with his elbows on his knees and his great hands clasped like a man about to pray and too stubborn to call it that. Sam held the book of black glass closed, as if it could teach restraint better if it did not look itself. Maester Keth had brought nothing with him but his breath. Verina stood by the candle's door and looked at Jon with a question that was also an answer. Jon took quiet dawn and laid it on the bridge that crossed the hearth, an old courtesy to the first true work. He went down the steps with Ghost at his heel, and the others came in ones and twos, as if they were guests to a birth that belonged only to the mother and child and the midwife and yet belonged to everyone who would later meet the new thing. The chamber was warm and the rocks sweated lightly, a sheen that looked like effort and not discomfort. The candle sat in its cradle, a column of night within night. It felt, to the skin, like standing near a person who has just used a voice for something honest. Verina put her hands out, not on the candle but near it. "Breath," she said. "Borrowed. We have borrowed everything, heat, skill, luck. Now we give." "Who gives?" Maester Keth asked, too afraid to be ashamed of his fear. "All of us," Jon said, because he had done enough alone in his life to turn aside from that path when he could. He nodded to Sam, who nodded to Sansa, who looked at the candle with the expression of a woman consigning a child to a crossing. "All of us," she said. Davos breathed out the word as if letting a ship slide from mooring. Tormund grunt laughed, which in his tongue was yes. They breathed, not together at first, then together by accident, and then together on purpose. That is what people can do when they are taught or when they remember. Verina spoke a word in a language that had never had a written alphabet and had survived because it lived in fire where writing burns. Jon said nothing but thought the word ours and let it be his offering. The candle did not catch as a wick catches. It woke as a thing wakes when asked by a name it had kept as secret. Darkness became attentiveness. A radiance rose that was not bright and yet showed faces to one another with gentleness usually reserved for those who have just forgiven each other. The air smelled faintly of salt and iron and something sweet that memory dislikes naming. Jon felt a pressure behind his eyes and did not resist it. What came was not tears but a sense of someone else politely entering the room and standing where the light falls so nobody would have to squint. Sam exhaled in a little sound and went very still. Sansa closed her eyes and then opened them sharply and looked at the stone wall as if she had heard her own name said far away and could not tell if the voice was friend. Maester Keth's hands came up, palms open. A man about to ask a question he feared would cost him his dignity and was willing to pay that price. Verina frowned very slightly, as one does when a song takes a turn one did not expect but recognizes. Jon saw nothing. He was grateful. He stood in the candle's attention and did not seek pictures. The hunger to see is a strong fire. He had other fires to tend. He thought instead of the seam on the path in the first dawn and the way the dead thing had become simply a dead thing again. He let the gratitude move through him like air. A word came out of the flame that was not a flame. It came as if from a throat and not from heat. It spoke in every language and in none. It landed on the room like snow on a sleeping fox, light and then heavy enough to change color. It said simply, "Debt." Silence is a skilled craftsman when it works in a full room. It moved among them, fitting itself into their mouths and hands and the corners of their eyes.
Some swallowed.
Sansa took her breath back with care, as if it might bite. Tormund glared up into the dark with amused challenge. Davos whispered, "Who owes who then?" as if the answer might be hiding behind someone's elbow. "Debt?" Maester Keth repeated, rolling it along the tongue where a man usually keeps curses. What do you mean by that? Are we the ones who owe? Do you? Verena did not smile. She lifted her hands and lowered them. It is a fair first word for a fire to speak in a place built by the living, she said. It is not a threat. It is not mercy either. It is a call to count. Count what? John asked, not in anger. He felt steadier than he had any right to feel. He felt, with sudden clarity, that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of answer. Not a miracle, not a doom, not a command. An accounting. Wood, Verena said. Iron, salt, lives we have saved and lives we will spend. The hurt we will cause without meaning to, and the help we will give in our stubbornness. Who pays for a line of glass laid across a path? Who pays for a blade that refuses to be evil? The dead? The living? The unborn? The word is not an accusation. It is a ledger. John nodded slowly. Then we'll keep it, he said. A ledger of what we borrow and what we give back. No tricks. No pretended blindness. We'll write things down in the second book Sam carries, the one that is all our faces when we've eaten and slept near one another. He looked at the candle. We heard you, he said to the ad. Tension in the room. We did not ask you to judge us. We asked you to stand with us while we do work. If you want our count, you'll get it. We'll bring you every debt we incur and lay it down like a coin. If one day you ask us for payment in something we cannot give, then we will say no, and we will live with that no. The candle did not speak again. It did not dim. It stood there being itself, which is sometimes the most terrifying version of a miracle. John turned and went up into the hall again, where the wind had returned and the sea had woken, and the people followed him because that is what people do when they decide they will. He stood at the broad hearth where quiet dawn rested and looked at faces. Red cord, iron link, salt and soot, fur and linen, eyes that had learned to watch snow without despair and eyes that still had to learn it. He put his hand on the table as if it were a living shoulder. Tomorrow, he said, because tomorrow is a word that builds a road. We set lines along the other path. We test a blade in the woods where the dead sometimes forget themselves and rise. We begin a school. He saw eyebrows, skepticism, humor. Yes, a school. Not of genuflecting, of doing. Children and anyone else who finds they cannot help wanting to understand. We teach them numbers and fire and how to be kind to things that can burn you. We teach that we owe the forest logs returned as saplings. We teach why the sea is friend and not only a maw. We teach that the line of glass is not a door to cower behind but a tool to go on a journey with. He paused, because he was not a speechmaker and had promised himself once upon a life that he would not become one. He saw Sansa's eye and found in it a little nod. He saw Sam's hands, steady now. He saw Tormund's mouth being careful not to grin too soon. He saw Verena's attention like a lamp that did not pretend to be a sun. We call this place a hearth, he said. We keep it that way. We will offend the men who love thrones and the men who love altars. We'll have to be twice as brave as we planned. If any of you want to leave, we'll pack you a sack and bless your road. If you stay knowing that debt is a thing we will reckon with. Not because a candle asked, because it is right. Someone laughed then, a small, sudden bubble that could have burst had John not let it stand. The hall exhaled. The wind put its hand to the shutters and rattled them as if to say, I am here. John stood very still and felt the warmth of the hearth reach his cheeks. He thought of the cliff and the cave and the seam on the path and the night that had said a single word and waited, and of what waiting looks like when it is patient and not passive. Outside, the sea went on being the sea. The glass along the path dreamed and would wake when asked. In the chamber below, the candle kept no time and all time, and if it had thoughts, it did not share them, which is sometimes the only mercy the world has to give. John took quiet dawn and held it without lifting it high. He would not let this place become a circle where men looked up to find truth and forgot they could look into each other's faces. He set the blade at his hip. Back to work, he said, and the room moved the way a body moves when it has remembered that breath exists to be turned into muscle and then into action. The night outside threw snow along the cliff's teeth and laughed with the quiet voice of something that had seen many schemes. The hearth hummed. The windows looked out. The debt waited and would be counted. The fire remembered. The stone learned. The North watched with those old eyes that like the new only when it has proven itself to be made of honor as well as boldness. And beyond the line of their awareness, in the wood where the trees held their breath for the fox and the hare and sometimes for human grief, something old turned in its sleep and decided not to wake yet, because it had time, because it had always had time, and because somewhere on a cliff a candle had dared a word and a man had answered it without flinching.